Right, so we have a lot to cover today, so I think we should get started. So, Ward, go ahead.
Avatar Meher Baba PJ. Okay, well, this morning session, third in this program, is on the subject of the ego. And here's what that handout write-up has to say about this session. The bastion or citadel of falsehood is the ego. While it originally arose in evolution as a vehicle for the gathering of consciousness, in human form it represents the primary obstacle blocking progress along the path.
I'm sorry, do we have any handout for this morning?
It's been handed.
Yeah, it's already been handed out.
It's already been handed out. Do we have extra? Oh, here it is.
Okay, we're having a problem with handouts. Do you have yours? Okay, I'm the only one having a problem with handouts.
What's the problem?
This is the main 2 or 3 page handout for the whole thing that I'm reading this morning's description of this morning's
Okay, there's
topic.
the extra 2-page. Did you get one of this? This is a layout of the 4-day seminar.
It's from yesterday.
What is it?
Okay, I found mine, sorry.
have
There were 2 pages yesterday and 1 page today, right?
You can have
okay.
a copy. You have it? Okay, give it.
Yeah,
Okay,
I'll be
then take
reading
it.
from this. I'll just put old pages of it. Yeah, okay. Okay, let me start this over. This is this morning's session, a thumbnail of the topic. The bastion or citadel of falsehood is the ego. While it originally arose in evolution as a vehicle for the gathering of consciousness, in human form it represents the primary obstacle blocking progress along the path of realization. Yet, Meher Baba's collected writings approach the problem of the ego in 2 very distinct ways. In the divine theme, he provided what we could call a structural account, in which he analyzes the ego into its parts. In Discourses, by contrast, he approached the ego from a psychological viewpoint as it presents itself in the life and consciousness of a seeker of God. So the main topics, the first is what I'm calling the standard model of the ego in Meher Baba's philosophy. And the second is the ego in Discourses, a psychological approach. So what this in effect is a 1-session brief version of what actually I spent 6 sessions on in Briarcliff earlier this year, 3 days. An extended examination of Baba's teachings on the subject of the ego. So we're just going to touch on it lightly and give an idea of some of the main things. I would imagine that probably many of you are acquainted with the Discourses on the ego. I think it's in the 6th edition. It's in volume 2. I just reread them last night, as a matter of fact. And there are 3 discourses here, and those would be what most people know. But what I don't think most Baba lovers would be really acquainted with, and this was actually, I would think, new to most people, just about everybody, is a whole different approach to the topic that Baba gave, starting in the 20s and running through the 1940s. And it reached its fullest articulation in a little booklet called The Divine Theme. I have the PDF of it. By the way, you can download this for free in the Trust website. I don't know if you've seen this book.
We have it actually.
Yeah, it got republished 3 or 4 years ago. And this is almost a facsimile, not exactly, but close to a facsimile reproduction of a book that Baba had published in India in 1943 called The Divine Theme. Now, it has been reproduced in the back of God Speaks, so it's accessible there. It's item in the supplement of God Speaks It's item number 14, actually. This is actually better because the charts there, they really need to do them over. It sort of confused certain critical points. So the chart that is in your handout is, in fact, this one here. You see it there? And the handout you got this morning. It's this chart here. And on the other side, turn the other side of it, is where the chart is. Yeah. It's this one here. And on the front side, there's what I've handwritten out here in my beautiful, lucid handwriting. You'll find it on that handout, along with blow-ups of this part of that chart. That is the fullest explanation, the fullest articulation of this model of the ego which Baba was giving. So I'm going to spend maybe the first half or a little more of this session on that earlier account that Baba gave, because I don't think people are acquainted with it. And it's really quite significant in my opinion. When we're talking about the ego, of course, we're talking about what most of us, except for those among you who may be God realized, but the rest of us believe ourselves to be. You know, the identification with ego is the root of the problem. So actually, this is not just the ego that Baba is representing here.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Charlie wants to record this. And I don't even know if the recorder audio recorder is activated.
Well, there's something up here. I don't know where it would be.
What is it? Because he emailed me, so he's gonna come back and ask for it. So we don't have a technical person. The team is not here today, right? Anybody technical here who could help us? Because Charlie needs this session to be recorded. Just remember.
Here.
Well, I presume this might be it.
No, it's okay for how
I don't know if it's operating, or I know nothing about it except it's sitting there.
Minu put it there.
Minu put it
I
there.
know, but okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so if it's there, I just have to read my email. He sent a bunch of instruction. I don't even know what it is. Go ahead, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Nino has it set up, he said.
Okay.
It's recording already.
Okay.
Okay, good. We're off and running. So this right here is the model that we're actually going to be focusing on for the most part. And for those of us who are gross conscious, this is you and me. This is what we look like. This is the structure of the false self that Baba gives. So I'm going to be spending, a good bit of time going through this. And it's based on Indian psychology. People may not even know that there is such a thing. Psychology is an old branch of the philosophy of most great civilizations. They've looked at who am I, what is the self comprised of. And in Indian psychology, especially from about, say, birth of Christ for 1,000 years or so, some of the major schools arose, both in Hinduism and Buddhism, both of those. And they shared certain characteristics. In a nutshell, and Baba appears in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s to have embraced this approach. Now, when it came to doing the discourses, Baba's explanations or his message went through a complete change after the Westerners came into the picture. Baba first went to the West in 1931, and then he went there, 8 or 9 times over the next 6-7 years. And he enormously simplified his philosophy, so to speak. He, at risk of not to offend anyone, but he really sort of dumbed it down. Because the West was, had a lot of intellectual genius. There was no shortage in that department. But spirituality and spiritual understanding was not its strong suit. And so Baba made everything very simple, very basic, deep. Those early messages are very deep. They're not superficial at all, but they're simple. And from there, he built it up again. So that by the Discourses, you've got something that's quite developed and quite sophisticated, actually. And by God Speaks, you have an absolute masterwork of metaphysics or theosophy or whatever one wants to call that. But a lot of what he had explained in the 20s, he left. Some of it he recapitulated and some of it he did not. So this stuff, this is in 1943, but it's actually, it was given, this message, this chart, this explanation in the divine theme was given to Easterners, not to Westerners. It was in 1943, the Baba had a Sahavas at Mehrabad. That was the middle of World War II, right? And it was very, very difficult to arrange for any kind of a gathering then. Transportation was not available. Food was not available. There was a huge war effort and everything was being taken up by the war effort. But they managed to have it anyway in May of that year. And Baba called 125 of his followers from around India to Mehrabad for 4 days. And they did various things, but the center of it was this, or actually this chart. You'll find this in the back of God Speaks in a redrawn version.
This was through Deshmukh. This is Deshmukh.
I don't know whether he was involved in this or not. It could have been Dr. Ghani or someone else. And this chart was drawn by Rano. This one too. In God Speaks, it's been redrawn probably by some professional, whoever did the drawings in God Speaks. And in my opinion, needs to be done over because certain details are obscured in the God Speaks version. Certain details very relevant to what we're going to be talking about, actually. But these are the two charts, and actually, these charts were the main focus of this Sahavas. It wasn't even the text of the book that was published later. It's actually the charts, because Baba gave explanations and then had the whole group meditate on the charts. And I can't think of another time in Baba's life where he did that, with a larger group having a group meditation. Do any of you know of examples? I haven't run across them. Once in a blue moon, like every 10 or 20 years, he had the Mandali do it. But it was very rare even for them. But for a larger group of his followers, I can't think of another case. That really does single these charts out. But what is striking about this particular chart is that it shows the structure of the false self. And the character, the approach adopted within this Indian psychology, coming from Buddhism, Vedanta. There are other early schools of Indian philosophy, like one of them is called Samkhya. It's a major early philosophy. The Bhagavad Gita is heavily invested in Samkhya. Also yoga, Patanjali Yoga, which is based on a similar psychological model. So this is quite related to those and uses a lot of the same vocabulary. And here is I realize this may be kind of, perhaps not everyone is fully versed on your Samkhya or your Vedanta. This may be new. But here is the root idea, and I think this is quite intelligible. Now, this, as I say, is a chart, an analysis of you and me, right? This, if you're gross conscious. For those of you who are subtle conscious, that's you. And if you're mental conscious, you're over here. But for gross conscious people, these are the layers of the false self. And They are organized from the inside out. And what out means, this is the gross body. And inside means this is the soul itself. And as you know, if you've read God Speaks, and we were talking about this yesterday, the soul in Meher Baba's account is identical with the oversoul. It actually, the drop is the ocean.
Paramatma.
Atma is
Paramatma.
Yeah, that's the root. That's Advaita. That's the root of Meher. We were talking yesterday about Advaita. So this is actually God. And these are the layers of the false self. So this is Baba's, actually, this chart is the only time, the only place I know of where Baba ever fully explained this. Even in the text that goes along with it, he doesn't really explain it very well. It's actually in this chart. So this is a highly significant chart if you're interested in psychology.
Why do you think that is?
Huh?
We weren't ready for it? He didn't need to put it into words then?
Yeah, it's interesting that he just sort of left it there. I think Baba kind of left a lot of stuff. He knew that people like Debbie would come along and work it out in the course of time.
So,
Yeah.
can we study layers, because I was only aware of 3, but this seems to be more
Yeah,
than
no,
3.
we'll spend a lot of time doing that. So I'm just
Great.
explaining
Thank you.
the significance of this whole approach, which I think is something new to the Baba world. Not aware of, haven't really been studied before. We spent 2 whole days, morning and afternoon, on this in Briarcliff, so there's a lot, you can go into it in depth, so we're just going to look at it quickly. But then, at the same time, this was 1943, but during the same period, as we were talking about yesterday morning, the history of the discourses, Baba was dictating the discourses. And his discourses on the ego, if you ever want to know exactly when they were first published, in the revised 6th edition, there is I just would like to draw people's attention to this because these are valuable tools. There's Appendix 7, gives every discourse and tells where it is in all the different editions. And you can thus find out when these were first published. So I think it was 1940 that these, anyway, I won't take the time now, but the Discourses and Ego were published at about the same time. And the fascinating thing is that Baba seems to adopt a completely different approach to the ego. And if that's all you had ever read, you would never have guessed this, that he had been explaining this. And to me, this is an approach that is directly related and based on Indian psychology, actually, the ancient Indian psychological tradition. But Westerners didn't know that. So when it came to the discourses, he just completely set that aside. And the discourses are very Western, but actually, I would say kind of global or universal in their style. And the discourses are discussing the ego as something that the seeker has to deal with, that the seeker would experience. If you're trying to find God, most of us are aware that this damn ego, somebody says something insulting and I take offense, But because I don't want anybody to know I'm taking offense, I smile. And inwardly, I'm aware this is my ego, and that this is keeping me from finding God. I'm sure most of us are conscious of this, and one way or another, or usually both. And the ego is everywhere. So if you're a seeker of God, the ego really does present itself to you. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Oh, God.
It's all over the place.
More than ever.
And if you're a seeker of God, you know that the darn thing's got to go sooner or later. So the discourses are looking at it that way. The seeker of God, how the ego presents itself in our experience. And Baba gives what a magnificent analysis it does. But it's all relating to the experience of the seeker, right? So I'm calling it psychological from that point of view. Kind of the psychology, the kind of psychology that a seeker of God would be interested in, that kind of psychology. But this is not. This is a pure structural analysis. It's like somebody looking at the body and, what are the systems? The circulatory system and the respiratory system and I forget, the skeleton and nervous system. A rigorous analysis of what makes up this physical body. That's what this is. This wouldn't be accessible to the ordinary seeker of God. So, in my understanding, and this is just I may be wrong, so you can question and destroy the point of view I'm putting out here if you so choose.
All right.
All right. It appears to me that on the subject of the ego, we have two very different bodies of material coming from Meher Baba. Now, they don't contradict each other at all, but the approach is completely different. Okay? Are you with me so far?
Oh, yeah.
So I'm spending the first part of it on this and the second part on the discourses. And this is just in brief.
Did you say two body?
Huh?
Two body or two approach?
Two bodies of material, and each of them representing a fundamentally different approach.
Are they complementing each other?
Well, yeah, that's one of the. I do think, as people start to study Meher Baba's teachings in depth more, that will be one of the huge questions. How do you interrelate these?
Yeah.
What is their relationship? I don't see that they contradict. I really don't. One is sort of like I'm calling it psychological, but can you think of a better approach in the discourses? It's
For this one?
No,
The other
in the
one?
discourses. It's psychological in a kind of a ordinary way.
I like it actually.
It's like the ordinary person. I'm trying to serve Baba, and I'm aware that my ego is constantly intruding itself. What do I do about the darn thing? And the discourses explains things relevant to that I can understand. It's psychological in that way. All the discourses have that approach. They're speaking straight to the ordinary seeker of God who doesn't have any special knowledge, who doesn't studied all these spiritual traditions. And right to that point, it gives you understanding that's most useful in dealing with these as questions and problems and dimensions of the spiritual life. All the discourses are that way. You didn't say that yet, but do you agree with that characterization generally?
Yes.
Yeah. They have an audience. When
Yes.
you're writing, they say, know your audience.
Yeah.
God Speaks is not written to that audience at all. But the discourses are right to the sort of intelligent seeker without presupposing any particular kind of commitment. You really wouldn't even need to be a Baba lover, actually, to read the discourses. I mean, it helps, but even if you didn't know who Baba was, and even if you didn't care, you actually can get them, it seems to me. And no background in particular. You'll need to know what karma is, but okay, you can figure that out. You'll need to figure out what sanskaras are, and if you don't know the word, after Baba has explained it 20 times, you'll probably get the idea. There's not much that he presupposes. He avoided technical language, terminology, all that. He spoke in a very normal way. He demystifies complex topics. He doesn't dumb them down or simplify them. I don't mean that. But he presents them in a non-technical way, in a way that seems like we were dealing with the discourse on Maya yesterday. That's such a beautiful example. He dealt with an unbelievably profound topic and made it seem like common sense.
Yeah.
That's what the discourses are doing. But earlier on in the 20s, the Westerners hadn't appeared in the picture yet. And a lot of times Baba would go into topics and explain them from points of view that Indians would get coming out of their spiritual tradition, and Westerners really wouldn't have. I think the world has changed a lot, and I think a lot of this stuff would be relevant to us. So now just a quick, just mentioning some of the broad connections of the ego. I want to put a slide up. I kept thinking of it yesterday, and this will be relevant to our thing this afternoon also. Let me see. This chart here. I've come to appreciate this chart over the years. At first, I didn't sort of, in God Speaks, I saw.
This is the best of all.
Yeah.
God.
I saw this chart at first, and it seemed to me all that I needed, and all the other charts kind of irritated me a little bit, because I didn't see why Baba saw fit to put them in. And over the last 40 years, I've come to see in this one further way what an idiot I am. So here, this chart is talking about, the one part of it I'll look at, the empirical sphere. Remember we talked yesterday about the empirical sphere?
Yes.
That is, our experience, God alone is real. We were saying that yesterday. All non-dual, God is non-dual. In supreme reality, there are no opposites at all. The creation doesn't exist at all. Right? We went over that a lot yesterday. But for most of us, we experience an empirical reality. This is a further account of that. And this is how you read this chart. You read this part like a grammatical sentence.
Oh.
This is how you read this chart. So, man is gross conscious through the gross body, which is, I'm putting in which is for an equal sign, which is the small gross shadow, that's here. He is conscious of the gross sphere, which is the big gross shadow, which is the gross nothing, which is nothing into nothing into nothing. Okay, see how you read it?
Yeah.
Now this is what you get what it's saying. Actually, who is this really? It's the soul. Man, the word man here is referring to the soul, which is actually identical with God. But I'm gross conscious through the medium of my body, and I'm conscious of the universe or the gross sphere, like this room, for example. So what is actually one, non-dual, there are no opposites at all, the real me, immediately gets split into two parts, if you can follow this. The subject and the object, right? Like I'm the subject, I'm me. And who am I? I'm this body. I'm completely convinced that I'm this body. And what am I experiencing? I'm experiencing this universe, the universe of this room. That's the object. In reality, there is only God. But as soon as you fall prey to Maya, as we were talking about yesterday, it gets split into subject and object. And it is through the body that you experience the universe. So what the body actually is, your body, my body, is an opening. That is to say, you as consciousness want to have experience because you have desires, right? You want, and to fulfill your desires, you have to have experience, right? So the body has its five senses. You see, hear, smell, taste, touch. And through those five senses, you experience the universe. So the body is an opening through which you can experience the universe. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I like that.
The body is an opening. That's actually what it is. And what is actually one, unitary, is split into two. The subject, which is the body. See, I think I'm the body. I may intellectually believe otherwise. but my immediate experience is that I'm the body. And the object is what, through the body, I see, hear, smell, taste, touch. So that's where the subject and object come from. This is empirical, the empirical dimension. This is experience of ordinary people. You get what I'm talking about? I'm sort of analyzing what experience is. That's what this chart is so marvelous for. And actually, people on the subtle plane and the mental plane are also in the empirical sphere. They're just in a higher order of it. So, yeah.
Apologies if this is off topic, but I'm just very curious. Is the object the same for everybody? And I feel like you covered this last year at God Speaks, but is the object the same for everybody? Like, do we all perceive the piano right there the same way?
You know, we would, it's a big question. We'd have to talk about the empirical, the individual and the universal level of things. I mean, we experience what our sanskaras permit us to experience. So our take on it will be personal. But there is a certain stability to the empirical sphere too. It's not going to be like this room will be here for everybody who's in it, for example. It's not as though you just I can suddenly decide that beam is going to be here, and it is for me. I can't do that. But it's a big question. I better not try to go too much into that. And also it's a big question that Baba never exactly spoke to either. So this is what the false self is doing.
Up there?
Yeah, this would be the gross in your charts. The outer, in that, you can see it, the outermost circle, outermost kosha. And this actually is the soul. It's not called that here, but it is. That would be the innermost circle in your charts, that little soul at the center. Okay, and this is explaining how that false self operates in experiencing the universe or the environment.
Can we talk a little bit about gross shadow and gross nothing, which is experiences nothing and nothingness?
You know, much as I would love to, I better not attempt
Okay.
with all the other
I don't
things.
know anything about it.
Yeah, I know, it's a fascinating. But we noticed we talked about shadows yesterday with
Yes,
Maya.
Maya. That's
Yeah.
what I was going to bring in.
Yeah.
Can we bring Maya in here and say that
Yeah.
Maya gross side represents, actually, Maya represents gross shadow or vice versa?
Let's go right to the core of it and say it's Maya that creates this dualist experience in the first place.
Okay.
It's Maya that makes me identify with the body and through the body experience the universe. So, all of that. Okay, now, so let me go back to this chart. Yeah. Now, the Baba, I have to really simplify this because there's so much. Okay, I'm going to explain this in any case. I was just saying that in the classical Indian philosophical systems, there are 6 of them in the 1st century AD or so. And there are 3 heterodox systems, or heretical systems, if you want to be severe about it from a Hindu standpoint. Buddhism would be one of them. But in these, they articulated a vision of the self that looks at it from the inside to the outside. It's hierarchical. The inside is the soul, and the outside is the gross body. Okay. In Vedanta, now we're just talking about the mind part of it. There be a gross body, which is called the Sthul Sharir. That term is there in infinite intelligence. And there's a subtle body, the Sukshma Sharir. Those are external. But inside of that, you get the mind. Okay? And these are the 4 components of mind. And the reason I'm presenting them is that basically Baba adopted this. Okay? Even in the 20s, you'll even see these words used when he was talking in Gujarati. Then he gave English words in that chart that you have. Okay, these would be the 4 constituents. Buddhi, Chitta, Ahankar, and Manas. And buddhi is the intellect. In Vedanta, it's regarded, this is like, if I can just call attention again, we're talking about our very minds, like what we're experiencing with it this instant. This is looking what the constituents of that are. What are consciousness at this very moment? What goes into that mix? There's intellect. Chitta is mind stuff. It's like memories, it's impressions, it's all that kind of sludge that's there. It keeps coming up. I don't know. Maybe you don't have any sludge, but every morning I sort of stir it up and it all gets muddy. Then there's egoism, which is right on our topic here. Egoism itself, meanness, me. I might be mine. No, that's mine. No, that's yours. That's not mine. I wish it were mine. But no, that's yours. I'm not responsible for that. It's that sense of meanness as being separate from others. That root impulse, you might say, is ahankar. And manas is, it's called mind, but all of this could be called mind. It's mind in this sense. It's, I'm getting impressions. Okay, I see Mary Kay. She's got a dress on. It's black and white, purple scarf here. I might hear her speak. I hear her voice. Things, all right, let me go to, here's my cup of coffee. I'll do this because I can bring in the other senses. I see it. If I spill it and splosh it, I can hear it. I can smell it, chai. I could taste it. I can touch it, all those things. Those are all different senses, right? There's no reason inherently why these senses should be connected with each other. Is there a particular sound and a particular sight? But somehow my mind associates them with each other and forms a concept, cup of chai. Manas is that aspect of mind which operates on sensory data, on sensory experience, and forms concepts and processes them in a basic way. Like, I'll see a person there, and a certain look, a certain sound of voice, etc., and I'll say, Rosie, or Ron, or Yorgos. So my mind is taking all the sensory stuff and forming a concept. That's the part of mind, it's kind of the part of mind that deals with my relations with the gross and subtle world. That part of mind. So these, are you following what I'm talking about? These are different. Let me look at some of these others now. What the intellect is. Oh, I jumped to another slide apparently.
Oh, we're jumping
that's
with you
what I
though, we're
was
jumping.
saying.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
so
No, that I won't try to explain that. In the 6th session version, we would go into that other one. But buddhi is intellect, but intellect is really not quite adequate to explain buddhi. But it's like that primordial flash of consciousness that sees and perceives and understands and cognizes things. I don't know, I think of it as like a flash of lightning. It doesn't have any content exactly, but if you think about something, suddenly your mind turns to it and is aware of it. I don't know does this relate to this? Yeah.
So would it be accurate then to describe buddhi as higher thought, like rationality and that kind of thought? Exactly.
I think it's beyond that. It's that primordial flash of consciousness itself. But it isn't pure consciousness, because it's consciousness particularized, given a particular focus at a certain time and place. Like buddhi might have a certain thought, make it possible a certain thought, or have a certain feeling. It goes here and there in the other place. Sort of the moving dot of consciousness, something like that. This is my understanding of it anyway. So it's, you might say, very at the root of our conscious experience of things. Pure consciousness doesn't have any differentiation at all. It doesn't, you're not conscious of this or conscious of that. It's purely is.
So
But
this four does not relate to pure consciousness.
it's not
These
the
four items.
no, they're not. They're not.
Okay.
They're definitely not.
Not. Okay.
Pure consciousness is God.
Yes.
Pure consciousness is the Atman, is the soul. This is once that's been splintered and fractured into a false self, the empirical self. And Buddhi would be sort of almost the element closest to pure consciousness. Particularized, brought into time and space, given a focus. But it turns and sees anything. It's always flashing here and there. I don't know, you know how the mind is always constantly going to one thing after another? I don't know about you, but I've got
In
this
some
voice.
people there is more than others.
Yeah, some people
wandering
still their
around.
minds,
Yeah.
but it's still there,
Still it's still there.
you know. That's what Buddhi is. Chitta, it's almost like it's your sanskaras. They're all the stuff that comes up, you know. Like, oh, I'm feeling sick today. Or, oh, I don't like so-and-so. Or, oh, it's nice, how sunny it is. Or, you know, all these impressions come up. Memories. That would be the stuff that's there in the mind, yeah.
Yeah, you know, what about associations? Have you ever noticed if you're not in an environment and you go into that environment, that by association it triggers impressions in you?
Yeah, that would be like the chitta. Why would those associations come up? Because this mind stuff, this chitta is there,
Exactly.
and it gets aroused.
And that would have to do with like 14-year-olds where
Right.
it's always said, you know, keep them in good environments so the good impressions surface and not
Yeah.
in other environments that would,
Yeah.
those other sanskaras would surface.
Right,
Okay, right?
that's right. So that's what all
Yeah,
this
okay.
chitta is. Because these other three constituents don't provide for that. Associations, memories, past experiences. That's what chitta contributes to the picture. Okay. But ahankar is sheer me-ness. Me, 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 me. This is mine.
As a developed,
Huh?
a state of mind.
Yeah, well,
Egoism.
yeah. So in human form, it's fully developed.
Yeah.
But we exist because of it. I mean,
That's, yeah, well, that's what keeps us, that's what the discourse explains so well. It played a necessary role in evolution, the ego did. And now that we're in human form, it doesn't play a necessary role at all, but we still got it. And that's me, I am not you. The basic thing which the ego is doing is it's making a coherent me. It kind of unifies all the stuff in me. You know, like, this is my computer, and when I go back to India, I'll have, you know, my this and my that. These are my clothes. No, that's your clothes, not my clothes, your clothes. Like that, where it makes a coherent me, and it insists that I am separate from you. Separation is inherent, is the foundational move of egoism is that. See, those other things don't do that. It's egoism. So you see these in Vedanta, are you getting what these four are?
Mhm.
These are the four elements, the four constituents. This is a structural analysis we're talking about. Discourses don't do this.
Very interesting.
These are the four constituents of the false
Very
self,
novel.
of the mind, because there's also a subtle body and a gross body. We're talking about the mind part of it here.
you know, the healers, a lot of healers nowadays are comprehending this concept
Yeah.
along with the bodies. You know, people are working
Right.
through healing.
Dealing with the mind.
Yeah.
The real healing is Maharaj,
Yeah.
where you're
There's no
gone.
mind.
It's like if you want to really get well, we'll die. Yeah.
Creativity, imagination, inspiration, where they all lie.
I'm giving a very simplified version of it, but actually those would be modalities of the Buddhi.
Yeah.
The technical term which Baba gives, and it's in this whole series of things, is Chaitanya. Chaitanya.
to the technical term for?
It would encompass, I'll anticipate, in animal form, let's say mammals, it's instinct, or earlier animals. In human form, at first, it's intellect. The higher form of intellect is inspiration, and that becomes illumination when you see God face to face, and then that becomes realization. That's one of these layers, actually.
So the intellect, another way of looking at the intellect is something that the parts we all have. We all have imagination, creativity, inspiration. Whereas divine stuff of the ego is where it's trying to make it particular to me. You know, my sanskars create my mind stuff. My ego, of course, has them separate and whatnot.
Yeah.
Is that another way of looking at that?
Yes, it would. I'm not really fully answering what you're saying about creativity and imagination, because when we start going through the layers more specifically, we'll be in a better position to look at that.
Great.
Yeah. That's what that chart helps with. Mm-hmm.
Very quick, I'm always into dates and history. When was this developed?
This would be over about the first millennium of the Christian era, that time frame.
Okay.
So you'll find this in early Vedanta, early
Vedanta.
Samkhya,
Okay.
and Buddhism had its own. I mean, I showed this, and we won't try to explain it, but this is Vedanta.
Wow.
See, this is another. We won't try to explain it, but notice it's fundamentally similar, right?
You brought this before.
Because the self, or the soul, or the Atman is at the core, and the gross body is outermost, and then the subtle body is next, and then the mental sheath, etc. I won't try to explain how this relates to what we're talking about, but you can see the relationship, the fundamental relationship between this and Baba's chart, right? Because that too is concentric circles, and self is at the core. That seems to be the central approach of early Indian psychology. Now, Western psychology hasn't looked at the matter that way at all. Not at all that I've ever heard of. For one thing, Western psychology, and that would include Islamic too, does not acknowledge that the self is God, right? In fact, it would be high heresy to say so. So it couldn't possibly have the same premise that this does. But an Advaitin approach that says the soul is one with God will naturally look at things from the core, the innermost center, which is God, self with a capital S, out to the gross sphere. Yeah.
So could you go back to mind again, manas, on the previous chart?
Yeah.
If you could just clarify that a little bit more.
Yeah, and I'm doing my best with it.
Differentiation very well.
Let me also say, I've tried to understand these things as best I could using the resources available to me. As I have said before, I don't always find all the books that I need in the Errintown Public Library. As a matter of fact,
It's a book club.
I have not yet been able to find the Errintown Public Library. But I do the best, so I may not take what I say with a grain of salt. I'm doing my best here. But it's that aspect of mind that interfaces with the external environment, like the gross sphere or the subtle sphere, through the senses. And let's suppose there's somebody's mowing their lawn outside here, and it's, and after 15 minutes, I'm completely unconscious of it because I'm absorbed in something else, right? Well, my auditory sense is hearing it, but my mind has turned it off because it's not relevant to what I'm doing. It's not my senses, it's my manas, which processes input and manages it. It's the manager of senses and also the conceptualizer. Like at first I hear it, I might think somebody's mowing the lawn. Okay, I hear a sound, my manas has a whole category of experience that applies to that. I don't see the guy mowing the lawn. Just from the sound I know what's going on. And my manas also says, that's not relevant to doing what I'm doing now. I can ignore it. And it turns it off and I don't even think about it again. Manas does that kind of thing. It's sort of the manager, the processor, the conceptualizer. Is this answering what you're bringing?
Well, I'm still confused, but at a much higher level.
Yes, okay, good. Well then, maybe we're kind of getting into the same zone here.
No,
I haven't.
because I find the differentiation between intellect, mind stuff, and mind on the chart.
Intellect is not, as I understand it, is not the content
Great.
of what you're thinking about. It's the pure flash of intelligence itself. So intellect would be inherent in any operation of manas. The manas couldn't function without the intellect flashing. But intellect is like that ray of light itself. And manas would be the conceptions, the domains of experience brought into illumination through the movement of the ray of light. Okay, like, here's I'm hoping this is true. This is the best I can understand. But like, buddhi would be like this little laser, you know, whereas manas would be the domain that gets illumined by it, the domain of experience illumined by it. Yes.
It's sort of like in the computer hardware stuff,
Uh-huh.
where you have a CPU where it's a processor. Based on what you get input, it processes and
Yeah.
gives out like, I can see
The
the,
manas
mind
is-
to
the
be
manas
the
is like the
manas to
processor.
be that.
The processor.
So
Okay.
intellect is something that prompts that. It's
Yes.
kind of, isn't it? I mean,
It's kind
It's a
of the
flash.
ray of consciousness.
Yes,
the
ray of
moving ray of
consciousness.
consciousness. And you can't actually be conscious of anything without that happening. Yeah.
I don't know if my struggle is the same as Sam's, similar, but I'm guessing the difficulty here is, being American, my imprints are Western, so I tend to try to relate these things to Western ideas. So I think in terms of Western psychology, and I want to see chitta as like subconscious. Is that a futile pursuit? Do you think to try to relate this to Western constructs?
No,
like that?
it isn't. No, I
Talk
think
about the difference in obviously like the self. The Western idea of the self with the small s is very different from the Eastern idea of the self with the big S.
sure.
So maybe they just don't fit. I mean, for me to think of chitta as like subconscious, is that?
No, I think that's actually, there's actually a Tiffin lecture where Baba does use it that way. Yeah. It would be subconscious. A lot of the stuff of the implicit ego, to refer to that, and sort of that stuff that's there. In that discourse, he talks about the explicit ego and the implicit ego, and the explicit ego is the part of the iceberg that's above the ocean, and the implicit ego is the 9/10 of it beneath the ocean. He uses that metaphor. So the chitta would be almost like all those impressions and all that stuff that's subconscious. Yeah, I think that's actually pretty good. And it's good that you're bringing up these things, and I want to reiterate, I've done my best to understand this as best I can, but I really can't pretend to be a great expert on Vedanta and Vedantic psychology. And I would love it if people would delve into it. Prove me wrong, yeah.
I have one personal problem.
Yes,
When I meet people, for example, I see you,
yeah,
I recognize you, know what you are. But if I meet you on the street,
yeah,
I will not recognize you.
yeah. That's
Except
the
with
manas.
Not other people. I cannot recognize them if they're out of place.
Yes,
I don't know why. My head doesn't absorb that much.
it's the functioning of the manas that you're talking about. The manas might be capable of, have capacities and limitations. You get to be, 110 years old, and your mind you can't remember anything anymore. It's all gone. Well, that would be, the manas is not effectively functioning through the gross body anymore. Like that. At least as I understand it, what you're talking about would relate to this level of things. Yeah. Because the buddhi is still functioning, it's just not the whole. You see, all these work together. This is a model of the self that Vedanta is giving us. So, yeah.
Yeah, so to me, manas would be more like it creates a reaction in you. That's what creates a reaction in you through an experience. of some kind.
Well, a reaction, that would involve, might be involved in that. And
Yeah,
sanskaras might be involved in that too.
Yeah.
But the manas would be the whole conceptual apparatus, which is kind of running things. Maybe the operating system, is that what you were saying before?
Yeah.
Like that, something like that. I would love it if there was somebody who would really become an expert on this. This is how I understand it. Baba uses these terms in the 1920s. Now here is I'm sort of skipping 95% of this 6-session presentation, as I mentioned before, just to give you the main idea.
This is wonderful. Thank you for doing this.
I mean, I think this is like a real powerful account. You won't see this in the discourses themselves. The discourses are, anyway, I've already said about that. Now here is these charts that we passed out. Let's get to the very end of this. I'm sure there's a faster way of doing this. This will get there soon. Oh yeah, here we go. Okay, so Baba gave various versions of this in Infinite Intelligence, for those of you who may have read it. The book Tiffin Lectures has some of it too. There's some of it there actually isn't, I don't think, in Baba's messages in the 30s. But this is the most developed form of it. So we'll come right to this. Chart 2 in the Divine Theme. And this chart gives, I'll put these words up here. By the way, I put the 4 words up here in case you want to look at them, if you can read my handwriting. Not everyone can do that. And diachronic. This chart gives both a synchronic and diachronic account of the structure of the ego. And this is, I'm using these words, synchronic means at one moment in time, and diachronic means through time, the developmental account. For example, synchronic linguistics, I studied this back in former times, would do something like take the grammar of the English language, nouns and verbs and subject and predicate and all that kind of stuff, or the rules of semantics of the English language, or the Persian language, or any language, or the phonology, da is a particular phoneme, pa is another phoneme, at one given point of time. Diachronic linguistics would study how language changes over the course of time. So like in the course, the diachronic study of English would study, modern English came out of Middle English at Chaucer's time, and Middle English came out of Old English, and Old English came out of Germanic, and Germanic derived from the Indo-European languages over the course of time, right? I'm just bringing out that this chart gives an account of the ego, both what the structure of the false self is like at a given point in time, and it also shows through the entire journey of the soul what happens to it. So I think in the future, boy, people are going to go wild over this chart. You thought the Beatles were hot stuff. People, the groupies will be screaming and passing out when they take a look at this. So let's look at how this develops over the course of time. These charts, I tell you, really, they should scream and swoon and pass out over these charts. They deserve it. So stone and metal. Am I in your way? Glenn, can you see? Okay. Do you see this little thing, this little S here at the center? Mm-hmm. What do you suppose that stands for?
Soul.
Soul. Meher Baba hadn't been corrupted by the English language, it would have been an A for Atman.
Yeah.
Atman, same thing. Okay, and here on the outermost, these, by the way, the Indian term for these rings or these sheaths or these layers, I'm going to put this word up because it's a good word. They're called koshas. A kosha is the singular. Koshas is the anglicized plural of it. A layer or a sheath. So these would be different koshas, layers of the false self. So you can see in stone form, there are, outside the soul, there are only two. You see what that innermost one is? And if you have trouble reading here, you've got it in your handouts. What is this innermost layer? Consciousness. And the outermost layer is the gross body. It's very primitive. That's all you got. Consciousness and the gross body. And you see this arrow here? It's a two-headed arrow, meaning both ways. The same arrow is here. It's here too. It's here too. So let's puzzle out what the meaning of this arrow could possibly be. Here it is again. From there to there. From there to there. From there to there. For the ordinary human beings. But now, if you go to this one, you see what's happened to the arrow? It only goes out to this. And can you work out from your charts what that kosha is? This one here, the second one in.
The gross body.
The subtle body. And you notice who this is? Human beings advanced up to the third plane.
Yeah.
They're subtle conscious, right? So what this seems to represent, what do you think it might represent, this arrow? What you're conscious of. So a gross pot, who is the one who is ultimately conscious? The soul is all that's real. The soul is consciousness itself. The soul is the only one who's real in this whole thing. The rest is all imaginary.
Are they equating? When we talk about soul, can we say consciousness?
That's kind of a big question in Meher Baba's philosophy.
I want to ask.
I feel it is true.
Yes.
But I do think the case needs to be made. It certainly is true in Vedanta.
Yes.
Atman is consciousness, and I feel that has to be so in Meher Baba's philosophy too. The one definite statement on that point is that comes to mind is in 1962 at the East-West Gathering. Baba gave out 21 points, and I gave a talk on this last year, and I actually love those 21 points. And one of them, he says that God is absolute consciousness. He says that. So I take it to be true. There are
Because
many
I've
questions you could raise, though. Yeah.
So Indian people talk that way. When
Yeah.
we
Well,
talk to
in
them,
the
soul
Vedanta
is
is the greatest tradition within Hinduism, sort of philosophical, intellectual tradition, and it's right at the core of Vedanta. And I think it has to be true for Baba also, but it could be contested. I would want to say that. But let's just take it to be true for purposes of explanation, because it's easier to talk that way. The soul is conscious of the gross body. Here, in animals, the soul is conscious of the gross body. So notice, the consciousness is going all the way from the innermost core out to the outermost sheath, outermost kosha, in one flash. When you are conscious of your gross body, in one instant, your consciousness is coming out from your soul to your gross body in a flash of a second. And it goes both ways, because then your gross body, you prick your finger on a needle. Oh! It goes right to your soul in one instant. You say, oh, it hurts, like that. So consciousness is going zoom, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But when you're on the third plane, it doesn't get to the gross body. You've forgotten about your gross body. You're not conscious of it anymore. So it only goes out to the subtle body. And when you get to the mental plane, you see where it's going? Mental body. It only gets out to the mental body. And I think actually this is manas. I think that would have to be the Sanskrit or Indic word Baba would have used. It doesn't get out to the gross body anymore. You've forgotten about those things. You've left those things behind. So this is one little thread within this really magnificent chart. Okay, so in stone, even in stone form, consciousness is going out from the soul to the gross body. So apparently stones are conscious of the gross body. There just isn't a whole lot of consciousness there. But such as it is, this is where it goes. What's different with the vegetable kingdom compared to the stone? Anything different? Another kosha. And what is it? Which one is it? You can always instinct, yeah. It's most undeveloped instinct. And I'm going to, this chart doesn't use this word, but from infinite intelligence I'm taking it, and if anyone gets interested I can explain where all this comes from. But there, the word used for it is chaitanya. That is to say, this is the word for this kosha, or this sheath. It's going to turn into intellect when we get into human form. We're analyzing the different layers of the false self, right? That's the process we're engaged in, and how they emerge through the course of evolution. This is the diachronic study of the false self. So if anyone asks you what we're doing, you would say, well, at first we were looking at a diachronic analysis of the false self with its koshas and so forth. You know about that. You know, manas and buddha. You can dazzle them with these things, right? Now, in worm kingdom, what's different?
Undeveloped subtle body.
Yep.
Subtle body.
The subtle body has come into the picture. And instinct is still there, but now it's little developed, whereas before it was most undeveloped. So there's more of it. Instinct is more developed in worms and reptiles. When you get to fish, the same layers are there. There are no new layers. The only what's the difference between fish and worms so far as this model goes? More developed. Here it was little developed. More developed. And when you get to the animals, it's fully developed instinct. And now look at this. Yeah, it's already expanded, isn't it? No, I can expand it more. No, I already did.
Is the consciousness different in the vegetable world? Are they different?
The only change in consciousness is that you are more conscious.
Okay.
There is no qualitative change in consciousness at all.
Okay.
In fact, if you want to be rigorous about it,
Yes.
you would say infinite consciousness is finitely conscious. Here in stone form, infinite consciousness is most finitely conscious. In animal form, infinite consciousness is more and more finitely conscious, or less and less finitely conscious, like that. Because it's actually infinite consciousness is the only real agent here.
Yes.
But it appears to be finite in its consciousness. But when it gets to human form, you actually have fully developed infinite consciousness. The consciousness is complete. There is no change in the consciousness. What changes is what you're conscious of. But the consciousness is unaffected by that because consciousness is Atman. At least if we accept the Vedantic account.
Yes.
Consciousness is God, yeah. Okay.
Is that like the lion looking at the infinite intelligence?
That would be, yeah, infinite,
Seven,
it's called
that's-
infinite thinking and infinite intelligence, which means
Yeah.
infinite consciousness.
Okay.
I know in Mariana we have these different diagrams. A lot of them have been blown up and are all on the walls, and you can get, it's very useful. Someday, if LA Center really gets into this,
Yeah.
you have all these charts in big and just put them on the walls. And who needs anything else?
That's right.
So now, there's a certain, from here all the way to animal form, we have the same number of koshas. And now let me explain this also. This is in the text of the divine theme. What Baba says is that these are all layers of consciousness. They're layers of consciousness. So this is consciousness itself, this circle here. And these are the layers of consciousness. Okay? So there's, you might say, a qualitative distinction between these and that one. These are layers of that, all the way through. Now, another point that would I need to really, spend a lot of time to demonstrate this to skeptics and critics, but I'm sure it's true. That actually, the subtle body and the mental body are there from the very beginning, even from stone form. Baba has very clearly said that. He said, the human form is all that exists. Even in stone form, a stone has a nose, a mouth, it has two nostrils, mouth, eyes, ears, the whole face, believe it or not. The whole thing is there. It's just all collapsed in on itself. So somebody would say, well, then why does this chart represent these things as emerging over the course of time? What I take that to mean is they're latent, but they haven't been revealed yet. But through the course of evolution, they get unfolded and they start to show. So by the animal form here, you have a subtle body has begun to emerge into visibility. But when you get to the full, mature, infinite consciousness of the human form, you see there are more layers. So let's go through this. What do we got that the animals don't got in terms of koshas? Mix. I guess I've already expanded this to them. I could go to this. Let me go to this one. Yeah, and I think I can even expand this. Of course, you won't be able to see what it points to, but no, that's no good. You got to be able to see that down there. What's new?
Mind,
Ego.
ego.
Okay, and let's put mind and ego on the back burner for the moment. How about these koshas? What koshas have we got we didn't have before? Can you see?
The mental body.
There's a mental body. That wasn't there in animal form. We have sanskaras, unexpressed desires.
Yeah.
You see what let's just go through them from inside out. This S means soul. This is consciousness.
Yeah.
Full consciousness.
Yeah.
These are all layers of consciousness.
Yeah.
This here, this red thing, is seat of individuality. Now, that's the only place I've ever seen in Meher Baba's books or teachings that have this.
Yes.
So it gives us wonderful opportunity to figure out what it means with no guidance from the avatar at all.
He left his footprint.
The next,
I can't see all the little words. Is that from Infinite Intelligence or God Speaks? I want to know where to look.
This chart,
Yeah.
it's from the divine theme.
It's in God Speaks, right?
It's there.
And it would be reproduced in God Speaks, but it's been reproduced in a way where this is kind of garbled, unfortunately. So actually the original is called The Divine Theme, published in 1943. But you will see it in God Speaks, yeah, in the supplement.
Yeah.
And your handouts have this, by the way. So you can look at your handouts if you're having a hard time reading this. Yeah, those handouts that Sam is holding up.
They're all out.
No, there's extra here. You just need to log
There's an extra here. Are there? Okay, you got one. So this is, we have the seat of individuality, and then we have sanskaras. That's that kosha there. The next one out, we have intellect.
Wow. Oh, so the fourth thing is here, huh?
Mm-hmm. And what was this back in animal form? It's intellect now. Instinct. Right. So I'm using the term Chaitanya. It's not used in Divine Theme, but it is an infinite intelligence in a way that, to me, clearly indicates that's the term for this whole thread, this whole kosha itself. So instinct turns into intellect for the gross conscious human being. Next is mental body. Notice here the sanskaras are called unexpressed desires. Latent sanskaras, latent desires. That's deeper. I think this is chitta.
Yes.
You know, but in the mental body, they're felt. Desires are felt. So when it gets out to there, you're conscious of them. Whereas when they're that sludge deep down there, you're not conscious of them. The next layer outside of that is the subtle body. And outside of that is the gross body. So gross body, subtle body, mental body. Were it not for this chart, I might have thought that's the whole picture. Wouldn't you have thought so? Mm-hmm. But in fact, this inner mental body or mind has a lot of other stuff besides just the mental body. And I'm taking mental body to be Baba's English phrase for manas. I think that's what he means. He used these words when he talked to the Mandali in the 20s.
Really? You think so?
Yeah, he did. He definitely did. There's no doubt. It's right in the diaries. He would use he never gave a course on Vedanta, but you'll read these terms used when he discusses these things. So this looks like it's manas. This here looks like it's buddhi. This sanskaras, maybe this is chitta. I don't know.
Well, if it sounds bad, this is stuff.
Yeah. But now let's look at these two, and this actually gets to our topic for this morning. Ego. Do you see what the ego is? It's a combination of this kosha and that kosha. This is the seat of individuality, that red one. And this one is sanskaras. Put those two together and you get the ego. That to me is the most rigorous formal definition of the ego that you can find in Mirababa's teachings. It's made of those two elements. Okay?
Can we talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, we'll get to this one and then we'll come back and look at them individually. Now, Baba, see, our English vocabulary is inadequate on a lot of these topics. So I really do think one of the reasons I'm bringing up these terms is I think we have to bring them in. We need to enrich the English I don't want to get too much into this, but let's say that the Western world has been known to appropriate things from other cultures. Why stop now? Let's take these words and use them. You know, the Sanskrit words, the Persian words, the Arabic words, they have a lot of really good words. And that's one of the reasons I'm trying to bring this stuff in, because they're much more exact in a lot of cases. So he uses mind. Sometimes Baba will mean the manas. Sometimes he'll mean these two layers together. Sometimes he'll mean the whole kit and caboodle, the whole false self. Because English doesn't have a developed vocabulary on these things. So watch out for that. The word mind can be used to mean many different things, right in this very chart. So here, he's defining mind as a combination of the mental body and the intellect. The mind would be the outer part of the mind, mind in the bigger sense. Again, I hate to use these words, but I don't see a choice. The word that's used is antakarana. Antakarana is buddhi, ahankar, manas, and chitta. That is all of this stuff here. These 4 layers, these 4 koshas, the antakarana. And it's a very good word.
It's a Vedantic.
It's Vedantic. Anta is related to inner. It's actually cognate with the English inner. And karana, do you know karma? Karma is action. Karana is doer, the inner doer. That's what antakarana means. It's actually a great word.
Yeah.
So it refers to all of this, the inner doer, the one who decides to do things and wills to do them. And then the subtle body and gross body actually do them. I don't know if you get the idea of antakarana. So Baba does use the English word mind to refer to this, to what's here is called the antakarana. But he uses the same word to refer to just those two. So this is a problem of our English vocabulary. Anyway, what he calls mind here is mental body, manas, I'm saying, and the intellect. And the ego, our topic this morning, is the seat of individuality and the sanskaras. Those two put together. Now, I'm just wrap up on this. You can see we could spend a lot more time on these layers. So then what do you think the seat of individuality is? And I ask this question in the understanding that Baba has never explained it anywhere that I know of. The only place it is in this darn chart. What do you think? The idea is the seat. He's not actually saying individuality, is he? He's saying the seat of individuality. Individuality itself would be something else, apparently, that sits there.
What I would say the metaphor that comes to my mind is like to achieve God realization, you have to use the metaphor of the mouth eating the whole body.
Yes.
And then the mouth has to eat itself. Almost like that mouth is the seed. Kind of like.
I see. Yeah.
Kind of like it's this last thing.
Yes. Yeah, it would seem to be the very last thing to go, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the root of everything else. Yeah. You know, when I think of like a seat of individuality, it's that sheer assertion of separateness.
Say that again.
The sheer assertion of separateness. Without there being any character to that assertion yet. Without there being any coloration. Without there being any personality. That's what the sanskaras provide, the next sheet out. That's why when you put the sanskaras together with the seat of individuality, you get an ego. But the seat of individuality is sheer separation, division. You know, in the beginning of God Speaks, in the second chapter, like about the second page of that, Baba says that the instant of at the moment of creation, the soul experiences contrariety, contrariness. I don't remember, Mary, quite contrary. Where the soul experiences a state of being at separation and at contrariety, at distance, a tension, because now it's separate from the ocean, whereas before that it was the ocean. Now it experiences that tension of being apart. That's what I think of with the seat of individuality. There's an assertion of being apart.
Well, it reminds me, it could be like this, the bubble.
Yeah, bubbleness. It's like bubbleness. The sheer fact of the bubble. And the sanskaras then are all those imprints that cluster around the seat of individuality. They give it a character. You've got all these sanskaras that make up for the ego of a Mary Kay, or a Ron, or a Mahmood, or whoever it might be. And if you put those two together, that's the ego. That's,
How do they interact?
huh?
How do they interact?
That question, and actually at Briarcliff, a lot of people were raising that question.
What was the question?
It would just.
How do they interact? They are saying all these different things. What is the relation? What is the glue that holds them together?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, then, would the seat of individuality be the limb? Like the who am I? Because then the rest is trying to answer that question through many different lives, obviously.
It
So
might
the
be
desire, the push.
there's an intimate connection with the whim, yeah. Whatever. Yeah.
Because why would there even be this seat of individuality then?
Yeah, the whim says, who am I? That presupposes and is part and parcel of, I'm separate. I'm a me. I'm an individual. Yeah.
But it seems that when it comes to this domain, is already been individualized. It's no longer that pure, uncolored, unattributed whim. It seems to me.
What, the seat of individuality?
Yeah, the seat of individuality.
Yeah,
Now-
see, this is what the great Baba philosophers, like those of us in this room, will have to resolve.
Listen.
Is there any
7 days
character to the seat of individuality? Because Baba hasn't said.
Yeah.
And I tend to think there is not.
Yes.
The character would be imparted by the sanskaras.
Okay.
Does it? Yeah.
I know in Vedanta this is called the Parok Prajna.
The what's that?
The Parok Prajna, the mistake of the intellect.
But yeah.
But without really going into what anybody else said about it, Baba said that it's like when the human being wakes up, he's fully conscious, he or she, but thinks, I'm a man, or I'm a woman.
Yes.
And that's the mistake. So it's right away.
Yes.
So there wouldn't be anything in there at that moment, every time we incarnate and have this thought, but that first thing, that's where you go wrong.
Yes.
And then out of that, he said,
The root mistake. By the way, Maya, you got it. Maya is operative at that point.
Yes.
exactly, I was thinking yesterday when you were talking, Maya appearing and disappearing is the whole story, right?
Mm-hmm.
But and then Baba said that the next thing that can happen is comparison,
Mm-hmm.
and that can give rise to desire.
Yes.
1, 2, 3.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was gonna say that, so all those layers is just consciousness, what is being aware of at one given time. So that creates all these different layers. Like
Yeah.
that seed is just what you're aware of at that given time. And then next day you're aware of something else, so you're in a different layer. But all the time you're just swimming.
Yeah, you're
around,
going
back and forth, back and forth. There
a
is
trillion times a
consciousness that is-
second.
It's just consciousness that is acting in different planes of consciousness
Yeah.
constantly, and so that's why. What is that? What is the seed? What sits there is just consciousness. Just having an impression or a reaction to something,
Yeah.
to the experience.
All these are layers of consciousness once again. Yeah. And it would seem the seat of individuality is where consciousness has been turned into a bubble, has been bubbleized, has been separated in some way.
Very strong, I would say. Very strong.
Yeah. And when that happens, Maya is in command. Because Maya, as we were saying yesterday, is that which makes the real seem to be false and the false seem to be real. And this assertion of I am separate and I'm a bubble is completely false. I'm not that at all. So as soon as you have a seat of individuality, you've got Maya. Maya is in the picture. By the way, Maya, there are a lot of, we won't have the time to really go over this whole topic properly, but there are a lot of descriptions of Maya in the discourse, of the ego in the discourses that sound very, very related to Maya. It's almost like the ego is the seat of Maya on the individual scale. So, what more should we say? When I went over this in Briarcliff, we went over each of these layers closely and spent a lot of time on each of them. But then the question is, a lot of people there were asking, how separate are they? And again, all we have is a chart from Baba. He didn't really explain it all. But in actual practice, it all gets mushed together. You know, that's kind of what Maya does. It sort of squashes everything. There's a nice analogy Baba gave in Infinite Intelligence of the hand and the stick. And he said, suppose you've got a pot full of stuff. There's paint, nicely colored paint. There's perfume. There's soup. I'm elaborating. Soup. There's potatoes. There's gravy. There's shit mixed in. There are somebody's eyeballs filled into it. In other words, every kind of thing, good and bad, it's all in the pot. Okay, and somebody's got a stick, and he's stirring it. Okay. The ordinary person, what's happened is the stick has become fused with the hand. They've become merged together. So when I'm stirring the stick, it gets all over my hand too, and my hand is all smeared with this perfume and this shit, the good and the bad. Yeah. This is like experience in Scaras, right? The perfect master, the stick and the hand are separate. Once he's done his work with the pot, he throws the stick away and his hand is unstained by it. So what happens is all of these get mushed together into one big mixed up thing. But I would infer nonetheless that these layers, there is an inherent orderliness to them. One is inside the other, but they're all interactive all the time. Like if I'm acting, well, let's suppose I go run outside for some reason. My gross body is running outside. Well, my buddhi, my intellect was involved in that. I had a thought, oh, there was an accident, something like that. And maybe my egoism got involved because I think of my Sam as a great hero who goes and rescues people. I'm going to do it, like that. So my ahankara got involved. So all these things are involved in their actions. They're not separate from each other because consciousness is going from the outermost to the innermost every instant. They're all interactive. But these are essentially a hierarchically ordered series going to the soul at the core. And let me just bring up one other thing about this Chaitanya, because a lot of Baba people have gotten very interested. Don Stevens used to do these seminars on intuition. I could really say, there's a lot more to be said about all of this. It's quite fascinating. But just to talk about this one layer, this one kosha. And by the way, these 10 items that are on your charts and that are here, these are there's soul. Outside of that, there's consciousness. These are your charts. And then there are 6 layers of consciousness, right? And if you combine 2 of them, you get the ego. And if you combine another 2 of them, you get the mind. That adds up to 10. That's what those 10 topics are that are listed in your thing. This is just a way of analyzing the structure of the false self. But now, if you get to your charts, I don't want to have to scroll through and pull it up again, but if you'll look at your charts again, you see on the ordinary person where the intellect is, there, that 4th one, the middle one there. And in animal form and the vegetative kingdoms, it's instinct, right?
Right.
And when you go to the subtle conscious soul, it's inspiration. Isn't it inspiration? I've forgotten what it's called.
Yeah.
And when you get to the mental conscious, it's illumination, right? Okay. So people often say, well, what is intuition? It seems to me that we're talking about that layer, that kosha, within the false self, that kosha. And the generic term for all of those, from instinct up to illumination, is chaitanya. That's the term used in infinite intelligence. We need a term for that layer itself that transforms from instinct to intellect to inspiration. And this is the fullest explanation of that I've ever seen. And this is from Lord Mayor, so I'd like to go through this. This is on 29 September 1940 at Mirabad. You can find this in Lord Mayor, as I say. Just as there are 7 planes of consciousness, 7 spiritual states, so also are there 7 states of understanding. He's calling it understanding here. He was talking to the Westerners, I think. So I would use the term Chaitanya. It is always 7. The number 7 is the divine number. The 7 understandings are, okay, and these are the ones he gives: instinct, intellect, inspiration, intuition, insight, illumination, and realization. Realization, of course, is 7th plane. I am God. And illumination, I would presume to be the when you see God face to face, the 6th plane experience. At the end of the Discourse on Good and Evil, Baba talks, uses that term, illumination here. He says more about it right here. Instinct governs the animal world. Intellect governs humans, that is, ordinary gross conscious human beings. Inspiration, for those humans whose feelings are developed, like poets and artists. By the way, in God Speaks, I think it's the 2nd item in God Speaks, he talks a bit about this, connecting it with forgetfulness, or a discussion of forgetfulness. Intuition is for those advanced souls who have conscious visions and understanding true to the point. What you understand by intuition is always true. I think he's talking about people on the plains now. What you understand by intellect is sometimes true and sometimes not.
These are also in Lord Meher?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, what some people
Just to
would...
be clear, Warren, he's not talking about intuition there in the general sense. He's talking about specifically, like you mentioned, for someone on the
It sounds like it. It sounds like it, yeah. And I would presume, for the case of a gross conscious soul like me, I mean, if you would say, I thought I had an intuition, but I was wrong, the reason for that would be that I didn't actually have a true intuition. If I did, it would always be right. So it's not intuition's fault, it's that I'm not always getting to that level of things. But apparently people who are on this plane, if they have an intuition, it's always true. That's how I understand the saying. Then the next level, souls on the fourth and fifth plane have insight. He's giving technical definitions of these terms. I think this would be the best source of exact definitions of these terms that I know of. I haven't seen anything better. So you have insight on the fourth and fifth plane. Their understanding is direct, without thinking with the mind. Illumination means seeing God as he is. The understanding is divine. I would take this to refer to the sixth plane. The veil is lifted and you see God face to face. There's no mediation anymore. But you experience yourself as separate. The seed of individuality is still there, and I am separate from God. But I see God face to face. And realization is understanding oneself as God. So this appears to me to be the hierarchy of Chaitanya from the earliest plant forms. Stone forms apparently don't even have instinct. They're so primitive they don't even have that. So that's this one kosha that you'll see in your charts. And with that, I think maybe for a first session that's enough on the structure of the false self. But this is new stuff so far as I know. I don't think the Baba world is really aware of this very much because it's only in this chart. It's not really, and some of the early talks. Yeah.
I just have a question about the animal kingdom and sanskaras. An animal doesn't keep sanskaras, do they? It's when we but when we go through that stage of animal before we become human, we retain those animal sanskaras in human form. But as an animal, if he incarnates as another animal, he doesn't take the sanskaras of his previous.
I think he does.
He doesn't.
I think you go on accumulating them in animal
And then you
form.
carry him over to human form.
Yeah, you're not bound by the law of karma as such. Because what you're doing is you're gathering consciousness. And all the new sanskaras you get are part of the natural process of filling out all the missing chinks in your consciousness until it's complete. Whereas karma is different, then you're suffering opposites in human form because your consciousness is complete at that point. Okay, so we want to stop at 1:15. I think we started about 11 or so. It's been about a half an hour on these discourses. Just touch on some big points. Let's see. I think I have them here. No, I don't. Here, sorry, I have to open up this. Here we go. Okay, so now when Baba was talking about the ego and the discourses, as I mentioned earlier, he doesn't talk about the structure of the false self at all. So he approaches it in a completely different way. But I don't see any reason why all that he gave about the structure of the false self couldn't be brought to these discourses on the ego over the course of time, as people really come to study these topics. So let's in fact start with the second. There are 3 discourses on ego, and he gives a very nice explanation of what the ego is in the first paragraph of the second one here. Someone want to read this out? This paragraph? You have a reader?
Sure.
Sam?
The ego is an affirmation of separateness. It takes many forms. It may take the form of a continued self-conscious memory expressing itself in recollections like, I did this and I did that, I felt this and I felt that, I thought this and I thought that. It also takes the form of ego-centered hopes for the future, expressing themselves through plans, like I shall do this, and I shall do that. I shall feel this, and I shall feel that. I shall think this, and I shall think that. Or again, in the present, the ego manifests itself in a strong feeling of being someone in particular, and asserts its distinctness and separateness from all other centers of consciousness. While provisionally serving a useful purpose as a center of consciousness, the ego as an affirmation of separateness constitutes the chief hindrance to spiritual emancipation and enlightenment of consciousness.
Beautiful description. I mean, aren't we doing that all the time? Constantly. No, I'm not like that. No, I don't like that. I don't like this kind of food. I like that kind of food. Yeah, I did this. I grew up, I did this, and I'm going to go do that. I mean, the ego is running the show most of the time, actually. So this is a really nice description. And fundamentally, it's an affirmation of an assertion of selfishness. What is that third verse? An affirmation of separateness, which really begins to sound like Maya. The root of the ego is Maya. It's separate and it asserts itself to be what it actually is not. It asserts me to be what I actually am not. So we have 3 of these discourses on ego here. And this appears to be their organization, as I understand it. The first of them is the nature of the ego and its termination. The ego is the center of conflict. This one seems to be looking at the ego within itself. And when you look at that principle of division within the circle of the ego, what you get is conflict, internal division, yourself at war with yourself. The second discourse, the ego is the affirmation of separateness, is the ego with respect to the outside, and that whole dynamic. And then the third discourse goes on to the topic of how to get rid of it. Forms of the ego and their dissolution, how to annihilate, how to get rid of the ego. That seems to be its organization, if you can see those 3 topics. The first one, the ego looked at within itself. The second, the ego in its relation to the outside. And the third, its forms, actually inferiority and superiority complex are the main 2 topics there. And then how you get rid of it. So that's the approach he takes here. And so go ahead and chime in, because we're not going to be able to go through these thoroughly, and a lot of you have studied these also. But here are some of the highlights that come to my mind, looking at this first one. Baba begins by explaining that in the pre-human stages, the ego played an essential role. The ego had to be there. Because when you had lots of experiences as a plant or as a worm or as a bird or a fish or dog or things like this, there has to be some principle for keeping all these different impressions in relation to each other, keeping them up and active, interactive. And the ego, as me, does that. It creates meaningful relationships between impressions. But it's not the same as the human ego, and this first paragraph really explains. In the pre-human stage, consciousness has experiences, but these experiences are not explicitly brought into relation with the central I. The I has not been fully developed yet. The dog is angry, but he does not continue to feel, I am angry. Even in his case, we find that he learns through some experiences, and thus bases the action of one experience on another. But this action, this is a very nice description of it, seems to me. This action is a result of a semi-mechanical tension of connected imprints or samskaras. I don't know, do you get that idea? Because I kind of do. It's like, it's almost automatic. Like, let's suppose you step on a dog's foot. It goes like that. It's almost automatic. You know, it's not fully conscious yet. Now, we still have some of that left in us as human beings, but there's more a fully conscious developed response that's possible to us that isn't to animals. It is different from the intelligent synthesis of experiences that makes the development of eye consciousness makes possible. So then the first step in submitting the working of isolated impressions to intelligent regulation consists in bringing them all into relation with the center of consciousness, which appears as the explicit, limited ego. The consolidation of ego consciousness is most clear and defined in the beginning of human consciousness. So what Baba really wants to talk about in these discourses on the ego is the human ego.
Yeah.
It's not the full diachronic range that you see in that chart from Stone. We didn't talk about the God-realized soul. He even shows the structure of the individuality of the God-realized soul in that chart. This discourse doesn't do that. It's just looking at the ordinary gross conscious human ego. That's really his topic. But he explains over several paragraphs that in the evolutionary journey, you have to have an ego, or you couldn't. He compares it to like the ballast of a ship. What is the ballast of a ship? Any of you ship conscious folk here?
The ballast keeps it level,
Yes.
and so we won't tip to one side, or
What is the ballast actually?
it's either sand or some kind of weight. It
Yeah,
could even be brass ball. Like steel balls or something.
like at the bottom.
Right.
Keeps it stable. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know, was your problem back in the days of your great adventure?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So the ego plays that role. It gives so that, when the winds blow, you can keep your course, keep steady. So there had to be an ego. So the first part of this discourse talks about that. But then the problem with it is,
What is explicit limited ego?
what's that?
What is he's referring to? It manifests itself explicit in the previous one.
Yeah.
Explicit limited ego.
Yeah,
Is that what we talked about? That seat of consciousness? Could that be related to that?
Well, I am presuming, and let me pose this as a question to you all. Sometimes Baba would use a word and its meaning would change.
Okay.
And the fact that he uses the word ego here doesn't prove that the definition of it that he gave in the divine theme applies. I just want to raise the question. I found many cases where it doesn't. But having said that, in my studies of this, I don't see why that definition wouldn't be completely adequate here. I think that definition would work in my opinion. But let me, where the ego is the seat of individuality plus samskaras, that was
Yes.
the definition given. It seems to me that works in the discourses. But I raise the question. That's just my opinion. The fact that Baba used the same word doesn't mean that he's using it in the same way. There are many cases of a word changing its meaning over the decades.
Yeah.
So that's that's for you to consider. To me, it works. Okay, but explicit limited ego, it's actually in the second of these discourses. And since we're just touching on points, I'll bring it up right now. He talks about that a lot there. He said, there is an explicit ego and an implicit ego. Do you remember that? What's the difference between those? Do you remember? It's actually quite related to consciousness.
the iceberg analogy.
Yeah.
From the Tiffin lecture. That's it.
Right.
Yes, the aspects of Sanskars that were unconscious or below the water, like the unconscious in psychology, as it compares to Chitla,
Right.
I guess, and the explicit would be what we're conscious of above the surface of the water.
That's right, yeah. He uses that figure. Yeah. So the explicit ego is the ego that we're conscious of. And the implicit ego is the greater mass of the false self. All those sanskaras that are not emergent yet into our conscious experience, that are sort of there and subconscious, as we were saying earlier. So he goes ahead to explain that in the second discourse, and he says that the explicit ego is more homogeneous. That is, it's more unified. It's not completely unified at all. There are plenty of conflicts, but it's more unified than the implicit ego is. Because in my conscious self, I've got to kind of keep my act together. So there are all sorts of stuff that I cram out of public view. I'm this kind of person, I'm not that kind of person. And I have a kind of a unified idea, of what I do and what I'm like and what my duties are and what I have a family and the role I'm playing. So it creates a kind of a unity among all these elements of the ego. But the implicit ego is a mess. It's all the stuff from my millions of lifetimes that's just kind of there. And everything that's present in my explicit ego, there's every kind of opposite is there in my implicit ego, what's buried, the unconscious stuff. So the implicit ego is much more heterogeneous and much more disorganized. It's just a scrambled thing, yeah.
Like explicit ego would be like what makes you believe who you are.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, you actually have sanskaras that are really both of them. That's who you are.
Yes.
So that makes you
Yeah.
have a reaction that's totally out of control. But it doesn't. You don't know that. You don't know that.
Yeah, because it's erupting from the implicit ego into the consciousness of my explicit ego. So the explicit ego is constantly changing. And actually, in this first discourse, Baba does explain that is why you're constantly experiencing conflicts. Ego, because there's a whole implicit submerged dimension that's got to come up, and it keeps inserting itself into our conscious experience.
That explains it.
There's some beautiful explanations here. Yeah, and here
This
he
is
says,
what volume?
huh?
What volume? What volume is
This is volume 2, if you've got
the
that.
ego. Okay.
Okay, so he said the ego marks and fulfills a certain necessity in the progress of consciousness. But since the ego takes shelter in the false idea of being the body, Baba keeps coming to this as the first move of Maya. You identify with the body, the gross body, and when you kind of outgrow that, the subtle body, and when you outgrow that, the mind. That's the first move, the first act of ignorance, you might say.
Yeah.
It is a source of much illusion which vitiates the experience. Now look at this. It is of the essence of the ego that it should feel separate from the rest of life by contrasting itself with other forms of life. It's myavic. It asserts separateness. That's the very essence of it. And it creates an artificial division between external and internal life in the very attempt to feel and secure its own existence. And because this move is false, that the ego asserts, it can't work, and it is continuously at war with itself. So inner conflict is the life of the ego. And Baba says later in this discourse, it's true of everybody. he says great and famous people and important people, so to speak, suffer from this just as much as ordinary people do. You know, you may look at your latest bunch of Hollywood stars, think, well, they're happy. They are not. They're suffering all this stuff too.
More than us.
Yeah, more if anything. And in this first discourse, that what Baba really comes to, he says all this is created by desires. And this is where that first discourse on Maya would be really valuable, where Baba talks about false valuation. And could bring that right into here. The way to resolve these internal conflicts, the first move is truth and values. True valuation. That's the first thing to do. And then he says, after truly evaluating, bringing true values to bear on your experience, then you have to act accordingly. That's always an emphasis about this. You have to do it. You have to see what is true, and then you have to act on it. Baba, throughout these discourses, keeps saying that. And there's a really beautiful paragraph here, we're just touching on this so briefly, where he makes the point that you have to do it in everything, little things as well as big things. You know, I think that's one of the signs of true spirituality. In true spirituality, you recognize the importance of the little things. I remember I was talking with Mani one time, and she said, it's funny what she said. She said, I've always been a mediocre chairman. That's what she said about herself. And this is why, she said, because I never was interested in the big things. I was always interested in the little things. Isn't that beautiful?
Wow.
And that really is spirituality, to know that the little things are the big things. So, and there's a really great thing he says about this, and that this paragraph on this topic. Just want to bring that up. Where is it? Oops. Hidden conflicts, yeah. I don't know if you remember this paragraph. So true evaluation has to be brought to bear on all things. He says 3/4 of our life is made up of ordinary things. And though conflict concerning ordinary things may not cause mental agony, it still, listen to this, isn't this true to our experience? It still leaves in the mind a sense of uneasiness that something is wrong. I have that so much. And when that happens, it shows that there is a hidden conflict. The conflicts which turn upon ordinary things are rarely even brought to the surface of consciousness. Instead, they cast a shadow on one's general feelings about life, as if from behind a screen. Such conflicts have to be brought to the surface of consciousness and frankly faced before they can be adequately solved.
Wow.
This is truth in values, true valuation. If there's the sense of uneasiness, it's like worry. It's sort of like a vague feeling that something isn't right. It's because there's a hidden conflict. Bring it to the surface and bring true values. This is so practically useful in how to live one's life.
It's almost emancipating.
And I think this is really like genius, this next thing here. The process of bringing conflict to the surface of consciousness. This will be like the implicit and the explicit ego that he talks about in the next discourse. The process of bringing conflict to the surface of consciousness should not degenerate, however, into a process of imagining conflict where there isn't. But now look at this. This is so beautiful. The sure sign of a real hidden conflict is the sense that the whole of one's heart is not in the thought or action which happens to be dominant at the moment. Isn't that beautiful?
Oh my God.
There's a real test. I'd like to read that again. The sure sign of a real hidden conflict
Yeah.
is the sense that the whole of one's heart is not in the thought or action which happens to be dominant at the moment. If you're not wholehearted in whatever you're doing, it's a sign that there's a hidden conflict.
Wow.
If that is not a guide to how to live happily, and then, well, what is the hidden conflict? And in my own case, I know it's time for us to stop, but in my own case, almost always, if I turn and say, what is it? I can see what it is. Somebody said something to me and I'm a little bit pissed.
Yeah.
Or I'm worried about my money. Or whatever the heck it is. It's not that hard to figure it out. And if somebody said something to me and I'm pissed at them, I can think, okay, what should I do about this? And I can usually figure out, okay, Ward, let it go. Or else say something to them. Or whatever the heck the approach is. But I can take some definite action and deal with the conflict intelligently, and it is gone. That's how to live wholeheartedly. These discourses are so thin, the little keys that give you the problems of life. And we were kind of running out of time, so I won't really be able to go over. Okay, I will take 2 minutes to talk about the second discourse talks about conflicts with the outside, the implicit and explicit ego, and all the tricks that the ego starts to use as you start to develop spiritually. He talks about guerrilla warfare, the spiritual ego. Early on the ego will say, I'm not interested in God, I'm not interested in spirituality. But later, the ego starts to say, I'm really spiritual. I'm really humble, like that. The ego can seek refuge in anything at all. So it's a beautiful discussion. And Baba says towards the end of that second discourse that in the end, the ego's tricks are so impossible to defeat that one starts to realize that you need a master. Only the master.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
We need our master.
And the third discourse gets into that more. And there, Baba talks about the inferiority and superiority complexes, and between them, assertions of equality. And he said most assertions of equality are actually just a moment of transition between a superiority and inferiority complex, or the other way around. And that actually you have to go beyond equality to the unity of all things, oneness, which transcends it. But he beautifully explains how the inferiority and superiority complexes are both based on the same limitation and inadequacy of the false ego life. And when you find a master, Baba says, the master beautifully makes these overlap each other so that they cancel each other out and you gain freedom from them. And this is something that a lot of people who don't understand spirituality would say against, say, Baba lovers. They'd say, well, you are worshiping and adoring this master of yours all the time. That's because you've got an inferiority complex. Right? And Baba says, fundamentally, that is not true because you identify the master with your own higher self, actually. Right. And you feel that through love. Exactly. And this is my own self. Like when Baba, the Mandali would see Baba, they would be so proud of it. Oh, Baba, look, you're like a kid, you're a child. Oh, look, he's walking. You feel that way about Baba. So you actually identify with the superiority side of that same thing. And in that way, you see, this is what the master doesn't gain anything from us. It's canceling out these two by overlapping them. And in the end, you gain freedom from both. Okay, maybe that's enough for this morning. This afternoon, we'll talk about good and evil.
Thank you.
So,